She saw the billionaire CEO with another woman and left forever. I gave you everything, Alexander. My career, my dreams, my heart, and this is how you repay me? The words hung in the air between them, sharp as broken glass. Have you ever felt that moment when your entire world shatters in an instant? When everything you believed about your life reveals itself as a carefully constructed lie? Victoria's voice trembled as she stood in the doorway of her husband's office, staring at the scene before her. Alexander Reed, billionaire CEO of Reed Technologies, scrambled to button his shirt while the young woman beside him adjusted her skirt, face flushed with embarrassment. Victoria, this isn't, Alexander began, his usual commanding voice faltering. Don't. Victoria raised her hand, silencing him. Don't you dare tell me this isn't what it looks like! What would you do if you caught your spouse in the act of betrayal? Would you scream, break down? Or would you feel an eerie calm wash over you as 15 years of doubts suddenly crystallized into perfect clarity? The woman beside him couldn't meet Victoria's eyes, gathering her things in hurried movements. Victoria recognized her now. Melissa, Alexander's new assistant, hired just 6 months ago. Young, beautiful, eager to please the powerful CEO. How predictable. How devastatingly predictable. 15 years, Alexander. 15 years I've stood by you, supported you, believed in you. And you throw it all away for what? A moment of excitement with your assistant? Alexander's face hardened, the vulnerability vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. The mask of the ruthless businessman sliding back into place with practiced ease. You're overreacting. This is nothing. A momentary lapse in judgment that has no bearing on our marriage or the company. Victoria laughed, a hollow sound that echoed through the luxurious office. Nothing? Is that what you call betraying your wife? Nothing? She took a step back, suddenly seeing with perfect clarity the man she had married. Not the brilliant, passionate entrepreneur she'd fallen in love with, but a cold, calculating businessman who viewed even his marriage as just another asset. Our marriage has been over for a long time, Victoria, Alexander said, his voice dropping to that controlled tone he used in board meetings. We both know that. You've been unhappy. I've been distant. This was inevitable. In that moment, Victoria knew. She knew she would walk out that door and never return. 15 years of marriage ended in an instant by a betrayal that had been building for longer than she cared to admit. But what would happen next? Where does a woman go when she leaves behind not just a husband, but an entire identity built around being his wife? If you've ever felt betrayed by someone you gave your whole life to, don't just scroll past, hit that like button. And if you haven't subscribed yet, ask yourself, why not? You don't want to miss stories that remind you how strong you can be. Victoria Reed had once been Victoria Morgan, a rising star in the architectural world. Her innovative designs had caught the attention of major firms across the country. And at 28, she was on track to become one of the youngest partners at Harrington & Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious architectural firms. That was before she met Alexander Reed at a charity gala 15 years ago. He was 32 then, already making waves with his tech startup that promised to revolutionize how businesses handled data security. His intensity had drawn her in immediately. The way he spoke about his vision with such conviction, such certainty. The world is changing. He had told her that night, dark eyes, alight with passion. Data is the new currency, and most companies are leaving their vaults wide open. I'm building the locks that will protect them. Victoria had been captivated, not just by his vision, but by the man himself. Tall, with sharp features and a presence that commanded attention, Alexander Reed was impossible to ignore. When he asked for her number at the end of the evening, she gave it without hesitation. Have you ever met someone who seemed to radiate such certainty about the future that you couldn't help but be pulled into their orbit? Someone whose dreams seemed so vivid, so attainable, that your own began to fade in comparison? Their courtship had been a whirlwind. Dinners at exclusive restaurants, weekends in the Hamptons, surprise trips to Paris. Alexander pursued her with the same single-minded focus he brought to his business ventures. 6 months after they met, he proposed on a private yacht in the Mediterranean. We'll build an empire together, he promised, sliding a 5-carat diamond onto her finger. Your vision, my drive, will be unstoppable. Victoria had believed him. She had seen their future together as a partnership of equals, each supporting the other's dreams. When they married a year later, she had no reason to doubt that vision would come true. The first few years had been good. Reed Technologies grew rapidly, securing major contracts with Fortune 500 companies. Victoria continued her work at Harrington, designing innovative, sustainable buildings that earned critical acclaim. They bought a penthouse in the heart of Boston with views of the harbor, traveled the world, and talked about starting a family when the time was right. But what happens when the right time never seems to arrive? When one partner's dreams gradually consume all the oxygen in the relationship? The shift happened so gradually that Victoria barely noticed it. First, it was Alexander asking her to attend more company events to charm potential investors and clients. Then it was suggestions that she take on fewer projects at her firm to have more flexibility for Reed Technologies' functions. Just temporarily, he assured her. The company is at a critical growth stage. I need you by my side. Temporarily stretched into permanently. When Reed Technologies went public 5 years into their marriage, the demands intensified. Alexander was now CEO of a publicly traded company worth billions. The pressure was immense, and he channeled it into work, staying at the office until midnight, taking calls during dinner, checking emails before his feet hit the floor in the morning. This is what success looks like, he told her when she expressed concern about his work-life balance. This is what we wanted. But it wasn't what Victoria had wanted. She had wanted a partnership, not a life where her identity was subsumed by his. Yet somehow, she found herself stepping back from her own career, taking on fewer projects, then moving to consultation work, and finally stepping away entirely to become the perfect corporate wife. How many of us have made small compromises that, looking back, weren't small at all? Tiny surrenders that, accumulated over time, amounted to giving away pieces of ourselves until we barely recognized the person in the mirror? Alexander Reed's wife. That's how people referred to her now at events. Not Victoria Morgan, the architect whose sustainable design for the Boston Children's Museum had won national recognition. Just Alexander Reed's wife, elegant and poised, the perfect accessory to his success story. She redecorated their penthouse 3 times, joined charity boards, planned perfect dinner parties for Alexander's business associates, and watched as her own dreams gathered dust in the corner of her mind. You don't need to work, Alexander told her when she mentioned returning to architecture. We have more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. Focus on enjoying it. But Victoria didn't enjoy it. The luxurious vacations, the designer clothes, the exclusive social circles, none of it filled the growing emptiness inside her. She missed the satisfaction of seeing her designs take shape, of creating spaces that would stand for generations. She missed being Victoria Morgan. On their 10th anniversary, Alexander gifted her with a diamond necklace worth more than most people's homes. That night, as he fastened it around her neck, she caught their reflection in the mirror, him in his perfectly tailored suit, her in a designer gown, the diamonds glittering at her throat. They looked like the perfect power couple. And Victoria had never felt more hollow. "Are you happy?" she asked him that night, after they'd returned from the 5-star restaurant where they'd celebrated. Alexander looked surprised by the question. Of course, the company's stock hit an all-time high today. "We're expanding into European markets next quarter. Everything is exactly on track." "That's not what I meant," Victoria said. "Are you happy with us? With our marriage?" He'd kissed her forehead, a gesture that felt more patronizing than affectionate. "We have everything we ever wanted, Victoria. What's not to be happy about?" But they didn't have everything. They didn't have the partnership they'd promised each other. They didn't have the family they'd talked about starting. Most days, they barely had conversations that weren't about Reed Technologies. What would happen to Victoria now? Would she find the strength to reclaim her identity, or would she be forever defined by her relationship with Alexander? The answer would surprise even her. Comment, "I relate," if you've ever given up your dreams for someone else. And if you haven't subscribed yet, join us now. You belong in a space where stories remind you that sacrifice doesn't mean losing yourself. The day Victoria discovered the affair began like any other. She woke alone, Alexander already gone for an early meeting. She had breakfast on the terrace, reviewed the plans for a charity gala she was organizing, and called her mother for their weekly chat. Around noon, she realized Alexander had left his tablet behind. Unusual for him, as it contained important company documents. Knowing he would need it for his afternoon meetings, she decided to bring it to his office. The Reed Technologies headquarters occupied the top 10 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in downtown Boston. Victoria had helped design the space years ago, when the company was still growing. Now, as she stepped out of the private elevator that opened directly into the executive floor, she barely recognized her own work. Alexander had renovated recently, replacing her warm, collaborative spaces with cold, minimalist design that emphasized hierarchy and power. His assistant's desk was empty. Victoria assumed she was at lunch and continued to Alexander's office, not bothering to knock. She never had before. The image seared itself into her mind immediately. Alexander, her husband of 15 years, with his shirt unbuttoned and his hands on his young assistant, who was perched on his desk with her skirt hiked up. They broke apart the moment the door opened, but it was too late. Victoria had seen enough. Have you ever experienced a moment so shocking that time seems to slow down, where every detail burns itself into your memory with perfect, excruciating clarity? For a moment, no one spoke. The assistant, Melissa, Victoria remembered dimly. Hired just 6 months ago, looked mortified, her lipstick smudged, and her blouse misbuttoned. Alexander recovered first, his expression shifting from shock to a carefully controlled neutral mask. "Victoria," he said, as if greeting her at a business function. "I wasn't expecting you." "Clearly," Victoria replied, her voice surprisingly steady despite the earthquake happening inside her. She set the tablet on a side table. "You forgot this." "Thank you," Alexander said, as if she'd simply dropped off a forgotten lunch. "Melissa, you can go." The young woman gathered her things and fled, unable to look at Victoria as she passed. When the door closed behind her, Alexander began buttoning his shirt. "This isn't what it looks like," he said, the most cliched line possible. "Really?" Victoria's voice was ice. "Because it looks like you were about to have sex with your assistant on the desk where we once made love when this office was first built." Alexander sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "It's complicated, Victoria. Simplify it for me. We've been growing apart for years. You know that. We barely talk anymore. We're like roommates, not spouses." Victoria felt rage building inside her. "And whose fault is that? Who works 18-hour days? Who cancels vacation plans for business emergencies? Who can't put down his phone long enough to have a conversation over dinner?" "That's unfair," Alexander countered. "I'm running a multi-billion-dollar company. The pressure is immense. I need support, not criticism." "Support?" Victoria laughed bitterly. "What do you think I've been giving you for 15 years? I gave up my career for you. I rearranged my entire life to fit your needs. I've been nothing but supportive. And you've been miserable doing it," Alexander shot back. "Don't pretend you've been happy, Victoria. I see the way you look at architectural magazines, the way you sketch buildings when you think I'm not watching. You resent me for your choices." His words hit her like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they contained a kernel of truth she hadn't been ready to acknowledge. Had she been complicit in her own unhappiness? Had she allowed herself to become this person, this accessory to someone else's life? "My choices?" Victoria felt as if she'd been slapped. "You systematically dismantled my career." "Just one more event, Victoria." "I need you at this dinner, Victoria." "Can't you reschedule that client meeting, Victoria?" Until there was nothing left of my professional life. Alexander straightened his tie, his composure returning. "No one forced you to step back from your work. That was your decision." "A decision made under constant pressure from you," Victoria countered. "But that's not even the point. The point is that you're cheating on me. How long has it been going on?" Alexander hesitated, and Victoria knew instantly that Melissa wasn't the first. "How many, Alexander?" He looked away. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." 3, he admitted finally. "Over the past 4 years." Victoria felt the floor shift beneath her. 4 years. While she had been planning his birthday parties, hosting his business associates, supporting his dreams, he had been betraying her repeatedly. What would you do with this revelation? Would you fight to save the marriage? Or would you recognize it as the permission you needed to finally walk away? "Why stay married to me then?" she asked, genuinely curious despite her pain. "You clearly don't love me anymore. Why keep up the pretense?" Alexander's expression hardened. "The company, the board values stability. A divorce would create uncertainty, affect stock prices, and you're good at the social aspects of my position. Clients like you, investors trust a family man." The cold calculation of his response stunned Victoria into silence. She wasn't his wife. She was a business asset, a line item on the balance sheet of Reed Technologies. "So, what now?" she asked finally. "You want to continue this arrangement? You have your affairs, and I pretend not to notice as long as the stock price stays high?" "Don't be dramatic," Alexander said dismissively. "We have a good life, Victoria. A beautiful home, financial security, social status. Most people would envy what we have." "What we have is a lie," Victoria replied, "and I won't live it anymore." If this part made your heart drop, hit like right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that they deserve better. And if you still haven't subscribed, don't wait until you're the one learning this lesson too late. Victoria left Reed Technologies in a daze, ignoring the curious glances from employees who recognized her as the CEO's wife. In the privacy of her car, she finally allowed the tears to come, great heaving sobs that left her gasping for breath. When the storm passed, a strange calm settled over her. For the first time in years, she saw her situation with perfect clarity. She had become a possession, not a partner, a trophy, not a person, and she had allowed it to happen. But what would she do now? Where would she go? After 15 years of being Alexander Reed's wife, who was Victoria Morgan, Victoria drove to their penthouse, her mind made up. She packed methodically. Clothes, personal items, the jewelry that had been gifts from her parents, rather than from Alexander. She left behind the designer gowns she'd worn to his corporate functions, the diamond necklace from their 10th anniversary, the trappings of a life that had slowly suffocated her. In the study, she paused at her old drafting table, gathering the sketches she'd created in secret over the years. Designs for buildings that would never be built. Dreams she'd been too afraid to pursue. She took those too. Victoria wrote a brief note and left it on the kitchen counter. "Alexander, I won't be a line item on your balance sheet any longer. Don't try to find me. I'll have my lawyer contact you about divorce proceedings." Victoria. As she placed her wedding ring beside the note, 15 years of memories flashed through her mind. The hopeful young woman she'd been, the partnership she'd believed in, the love she thought would last a lifetime. All gone now, replaced by the harsh reality of who Alexander Reed truly was. Victoria took one last look at the penthouse that had never really felt like home, then walked out the door, closing it firmly behind her. She had no idea where she was going, only that she couldn't stay. But sometimes, the most important journeys begin without a destination. If you've ever had to walk away from someone you love just to save yourself, drop a love emoji in the comments. Hit that subscribe button now, because these are the stories that help people like you rise again. Victoria drove north along the coast, no destination in mind, just the need to put distance between herself and Boston. The familiar skyline receded in her rearview mirror, 15 years of her life shrinking until it disappeared entirely. She had called her lawyer from the road, instructing him to begin divorce proceedings and to ensure Alexander couldn't access her personal accounts. The considerable wealth she'd inherited from her grandmother remained untouched in a separate account, something Alexander had never known about. It would give her time to figure out her next steps. As miles of coastline passed by her window, Victoria felt the tight band around her chest begin to loosen. Each mile brought a new breath, slightly easier than the last. She rolled down the window, letting the salt air fill the car. It smelled like possibility. "Who am I now?" she asked aloud, her voice nearly lost in the rush of wind. For so long, she had been Alexander Reed's wife. Before that, she had been Victoria Morgan, the promising young architect. But who was she now, at 43, starting over? She didn't have an answer yet, but for the first time in years, the question felt exciting rather than terrifying. How many of us stay in situations we've outgrown, simply because we fear the unknown more than we fear the slow death of our spirits? Victoria drove until sunset, stopping only for gas and coffee. As darkness fell, she realized she needed to find a place to stay for the night. The next exit sign indicated a small coastal town called Harborview, 5 miles ahead. The name resonated with her, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was simply the promise of a view, a new perspective. Harborview turned out to be a picturesque New England town, the kind featured on postcards and in travel magazines. Victorian houses lined quiet streets, their windows glowing warmly against the gathering darkness. The main street featured independent shops rather than chains. A bookstore, a cafe, an antique shop, all closed now for the evening. Victoria found a small inn near the harbor, a charming building with a wide porch and rocking chairs facing the water. The proprietor, an older woman named Eleanor, showed her to a cozy room overlooking the bay. "Just passing through?" Eleanor asked as she handed over the key. "I'm not sure," Victoria replied honestly. "I'm between destinations at the moment." Eleanor nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Well, Harborview has a way of helping people find their bearings. Breakfast is served from 7 to 9. Sleep well. Have you ever encountered a stranger whose simple kindness felt like a lifeline when you were drowning? Someone who seemed to understand exactly what you needed without you having to explain?" Alone in the quiet room, Victoria sat by the window, watching moonlight shimmer on the water. For the first time in years, she had no schedule to follow, no social obligations to fulfill, no husband's needs to prioritize. The freedom felt both exhilarating and terrifying. She opened her laptop, hesitated, then closed it again without checking her email. Whatever crisis Alexander might be creating over her departure could wait. Tonight was for her alone. Victoria slept deeply that night, lulled by the distant sound of waves against the shore. She woke to sunlight streaming through the curtains and the smell of coffee and baking bread drifting up from below. For a moment, she forgot everything. The betrayal, her hasty departure, the uncertainty of her future. Then, reality returned. But strangely, it didn't bring the crushing weight she expected. After breakfast in the inn's sunny dining room, Victoria decided to explore Harborview. The town was even more charming in daylight, with flower boxes brightening storefronts and American flags fluttering from porches. People nodded and smiled as she passed, a friendliness she had forgotten existed after years in Boston's more reserved social circles. Victoria found herself drawn to the harbor, where fishing boats bobbed alongside sleek sailboats. She sat on a bench overlooking the water, watching seagulls wheel overhead and breathing in the bracing salt air. For the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt her shoulders relax, the constant tension easing from her body. "First time in Harborview?" asked a voice beside her. Victoria turned to see an older man with weathered skin and kind eyes, settling onto the other end of the bench. "Is it that obvious?" she asked with a small smile. "We don't get many visitors this time of year," he explained. "Tourist season doesn't start for another month. I'm George, by the way, harbor master." "Victoria," she replied, offering her hand. "And yes, first time. It's a beautiful town. Been here my whole life," George said proudly. "Wouldn't live anywhere else. Something about this place gets in your blood." Victoria could understand why. There was a peacefulness to Harborview that she hadn't experienced in years. The rhythm of the waves, the unhurried pace of the locals, the sense that time moved differently here. "Any recommendations for what I should see while I'm here?" she asked. George thought for a moment. "Well, there's the Historical Society if you're interested in local history. Good seafood at Mabel's down the street. But if you want something special," he pointed toward the northern edge of the bay, where a rocky promontory jutted into the water. "The lighthouse. Best view in town from up there." Victoria followed his gaze and felt her breath catch. Perched on the cliff stood a lighthouse, its white tower stark against the blue sky. Even from this distance, she could see that it had seen better days. The paint was peeling, and part of the keeper's house attached to it appeared to be in disrepair. Yet something about it called to her, a silent beacon drawing her attention. What is it about certain places that speak to our souls? Have you ever encountered a building, a landscape, a corner of the world that seemed to be waiting just for you? "Is it still operational?" she asked, unable to take her eyes off it. George shook his head. "Not for about 10 years now. Coast Guard automated most lighthouses years ago, but they kept a keeper here longer than most because of the dangerous shoals. When the last keeper retired, they installed an automated beacon on a steel tower about a mile down the coast. More efficient, they said." He sighed. "Shame to see the old girl sitting empty, though. It's for sale," he added after a moment. "Has been for years. Nobody wants to take on a restoration that big." especially in such an isolated spot. Victoria felt something stir inside her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in so long that it took her a moment to recognize it. Interest. Genuine, professional interest. "Is there a way to get up there?" she asked. "To see it up close?" "Road's a bit rough, but passable. Just follow Harbor Street north until it turns into Lighthouse Road. Can't miss it." George studied her curiously. "You an architect or something?" Victoria smiled, surprised by how good it felt to claim her identity again. Yes, I am. If you've ever driven away from your past and didn't know where you were headed, give this video a like. And if you're still not subscribed, this channel is your safe place. Subscribe and stay with us. Victoria followed George's directions, driving slowly along the winding coastal road. With each turn, the lighthouse grew larger, calling to her in a way she couldn't explain. When she finally parked in the overgrown lot at the base of the promontory, she sat for a moment, taking in the structure before her. The lighthouse itself was a classic New England design, a white cylindrical tower about 80 feet tall, topped by a glass lantern room. Attached to it was the keeper's house, a two-story structure that had once been handsome but now showed clear signs of neglect. Shutters hung askew, windows were boarded up, and the once white paint had weathered to a dull gray. Yet despite its dilapidated state, there was something undeniably beautiful about it. The proportions were elegant, the setting spectacular. Victoria could imagine how it must have looked in its prime, a beacon of safety shining out over treacherous waters. As she approached, she noticed a car parked nearby, a practical sedan that seemed out of place in the wild setting. Before she could wonder about it, the front door of the keeper's house opened, and a woman in a business suit emerged, looking harried. "Hello there," the woman called, hurrying toward Victoria. "Are you lost? This property is private, though currently for sale." "I heard it was for sale," Victoria replied. "I'd like to see it, if that's possible." The woman's expression brightened immediately. "Really? I'm Janet Winters, the listing agent. I was just updating some photos for the listing. It's been on the market for quite some time." "I can imagine," Victoria said, looking up at the tower. "It needs substantial work." "That's putting it mildly," Janet agreed with a sigh. "The structure is sound. They built these places to last. But everything else needs updating. Wiring, plumbing, windows, roof. It's a major project. Most people want something more conventional." Victoria nodded, but she was barely listening. She was already seeing past the decay, envisioning what the lighthouse could become with the right restoration. Her mind, dormant for too long, was suddenly alive with possibilities. Could this broken-down lighthouse be the project that would help her rebuild her own life? "May I look inside?" she asked. Janet seemed surprised, but quickly recovered. "Of course, though I should warn you, it's quite rough. Watch your step." The interior of the keeper's house was as neglected as the exterior. Dust-covered floors, peeling wallpaper, cobwebs in corners. But Victoria saw beyond the cosmetic issues to the bones of the place. High ceilings, large windows positioned to capture spectacular views, solid oak floors beneath the grime. "The kitchen would need a complete overhaul," Janet was saying as they moved through the space. "And the bathrooms are hopelessly outdated. The previous owner started some renovations but ran out of money. That's why those walls are partially demolished." Victoria nodded, but her attention was already elsewhere. "What about the tower? Can we see that too?" Janet led her through a connecting door into the base of the lighthouse tower. A spiral staircase wound upward, disappearing into shadows above. "The stairs are steel, so they're still sturdy," Janet explained. "The lantern room at the top is intact, though the original Fresnel lens was removed by the Coast Guard when they decommissioned it. There's a 360-degree view from up there that's absolutely breathtaking. Would you like to climb up?" "Absolutely," Victoria said without hesitation. The climb was longer than she expected, the spiral staircase seeming to go on forever. By the time they reached the top, Victoria was slightly winded, but the moment she stepped into the lantern room, all fatigue vanished. The view was beyond breathtaking. The Atlantic stretched endlessly before her, sunlight dancing on its surface. To the south, she could see the entirety of Harborview, its harbor and colorful buildings nestled against the shoreline. To the north, rugged coastline extended as far as the eye could see, undeveloped and wild. Have you ever stood in a place and felt, with absolute certainty, That you were exactly where you were meant to be? As if the universe had been guiding you there all along? Victoria moved slowly around the circular room, taking in the view from every angle. The glass panes were dirty, and some were cracked, but even that couldn't diminish the majesty of what lay beyond. "It's something, isn't it?" Janet said softly, recognizing Victoria's awe. "On clear days, you can see all the way to the islands offshore. And during storms? Well, it's both terrifying and magnificent up here." "What's the asking price?" Victoria asked, still gazing out at the horizon. Janet named a figure that was surprisingly modest, a reflection of the property's condition and remote location. "Of course, you'd need to budget at least that much again for renovations," she added quickly. "Possibly more, depending on how extensive." "I'll take it," Victoria said, the words leaving her mouth before she'd consciously formed the thought. Janet blinked in surprise. You'll want to have an inspection done first, surely. And there are structural reports you should review. The septic system alone." "I'll take it," Victoria repeated, turning to face the agent. "As is. Don't you want to see the rest of the property? There's a small outbuilding that could be converted to a garage, and the grounds extend all the way down to a private cove." Victoria smiled, feeling more certain of this decision than she had of anything in years. "I'll see all of that later, but my answer won't change. This is exactly what I'm looking for." Janet studied her with a mixture of confusion and hope. "May I ask, why this property? Most people want something more." Victoria turned back to the view, watching a seagull soar past on the updraft. "I'm not most people," she said simply, "and I think this lighthouse and I understand each other. We both need a second chance. Sometimes the most broken places become the strongest. Sometimes the most unexpected detours lead to the most meaningful destinations. And sometimes a crumbling lighthouse on a lonely cliff can become the center of a universe built on second chances. If this lighthouse already feels like a symbol of hope, hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe. You'll want to see what this place becomes." The purchase process moved with surprising speed. Victoria paid cash, eliminating the need for financing approvals. She waived inspections, acknowledging in writing that she understood the property's condition. Within 2 weeks, she had the keys in hand and officially owned a lighthouse. On her first night as owner, Victoria arrived with minimal supplies: an air mattress, sleeping bag, basic toiletries, and enough food for a few days. The electricity had been turned on, though she discovered only about half the outlets and light fixtures actually worked. The water ran rust-colored at first, then cleared to a slightly yellowish tint that she decided was good enough for now, though she made a mental note to have the well tested. As darkness fell, Victoria climbed the tower with a flashlight and a bottle of champagne. The lantern room was cold, the April night bringing a chill wind off the water. But she didn't mind. She settled on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, and watched as stars appeared in the darkening sky. "To new beginnings," she said aloud, raising the bottle in a toast before taking a swig directly from it, something the polished corporate wife would never have done. The solitude was profound. No city noise, no neighbors, no husband coming home late from the office, just the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below and the occasional cry of a night bird. For the first time since discovering Alexander's betrayal, Victoria allowed herself to fully feel the pain of it. Not just the hurt of his infidelity, but the deeper wound of realizing that their entire marriage had been built on shifting sand. That the partnership she thought they had was merely an illusion, a convenient arrangement that served his needs while slowly erasing her own. Tears came, hot and cleansing, streaming down her face as she sat alone in the darkness. She cried for the young woman who had given up her dreams so easily, for the years spent living someone else's life, for the children they had never had, because Alexander always said, the timing isn't right. When the storm of emotion finally passed, Victoria felt lighter. The pain wasn't gone, but it had transformed into something else. Determination. Determination to reclaim her life, to rebuild it on her own terms, just as she would rebuild this lighthouse. Ever felt scared to start again, but did it anyway? Comment below. We're building a family of survivors here. And if you're not subscribed, don't leave. You're one of us now. Victoria woke with the sunrise, her body stiff from the air mattress, but her mind clearer than it had been in years. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and a granola bar, she changed into work clothes, jeans and a t-shirt, items that had rarely seen use in her previous life, and began the first phase of her restoration project, cleaning. She started in what would be her bedroom, attacking years of dust and grime with determination. By midday, she had cleared enough space to move her air mattress into the room, a small victory that felt surprisingly significant. Sometimes the biggest journeys begin with the smallest steps, cleaning a single room, making one space habitable in the midst of chaos. As she worked, Victoria found herself talking aloud, to the lighthouse, to herself, to the ghosts of keepers past, who had maintained the light through countless storms. "We're going to bring you back," she told the building as she scrubbed decades of grime from a window, revealing a spectacular ocean view. "Better than before." The physical labor was therapeutic, using muscles long neglected during her years of charity luncheons and corporate events. By evening, her hands were raw, her back ached, and she had never felt more alive. There was something profoundly satisfying about tangible work. Seeing immediate results, making visible progress, using her body as well as her mind. The next day brought a new challenge, assessing the electrical system. Victoria had basic knowledge from her architectural training, but quickly realized the lighthouse's wiring was beyond her expertise. Some areas had been updated in the 1980 seconds, while others still had knob and tube wiring from the early 1900s. It was a dangerous patchwork that needed professional attention. On her third day, Victoria drove into Harborview to find supplies and, hopefully, recommendations for local contractors. The hardware store on Main Street became her first stop, where she loaded a cart with cleaning supplies, basic tools, and painting materials. "That's quite a haul," commented the man at the register, an older gentleman with a friendly smile. "You working on a big project?" "The lighthouse," Victoria replied, handing over her credit card. "I just bought it." The man's eyebrows shot up. "You're the one who bought old Harborview Light?" "Well, I'll be. That place has been sitting empty for years. Folks around here thought it might just crumble into the sea." "Not if I can help it," Victoria said with determination. "Good for you," he said, genuine approval in his voice. "Name's Frank, by the way, Frank Miller. My family's owned this store for 3 generations." "Victoria Morgan," she replied, deliberately using her maiden name. "Pleasure to meet you." "Morgan, not Reed," came a voice from behind her. Victoria turned, startled, to find a tall man with salt and pepper hair watching her with interest. He was perhaps in his early 50s, with the weathered look of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, dressed in worn jeans and a flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal tanned, muscular forearms. "I'm sorry?" Victoria said, confused by the question. "Your credit card?" he explained, nodding toward the counter where her card lay. "It says Victoria Reed, but you introduced yourself as Morgan." Victoria felt heat rise to her cheeks, caught in a discrepancy she hadn't anticipated. "Morgan is my maiden name," she explained stiffly. "I'm in the process of reverting to it." The man nodded, understanding crossing his features. "Ah, recent change then." "Very recent," Victoria confirmed, not elaborating further. "Nathan Callahan," he said, extending his hand. "I couldn't help overhearing you bought the lighthouse." Victoria shook his hand, noting the calluses that spoke of manual labor. "Yes, I did, 3 days ago." "Brave woman," Nathan said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "That place needs a lot of work." "I'm discovering that," Victoria agreed, "especially the electrical system. I was just about to ask Frank if he could recommend someone." "You're looking at him," Frank interjected, bagging Victoria's purchases. "Nathan here is the best restoration specialist in the county. Done work on half the historical buildings in town." Nathan shrugged modestly. "I specialize in older structures, know their quirks, their particular needs." Victoria studied him with new interest. "Are you an electrician?" "Among other things," Nathan replied, "licensed in electrical, plumbing, and general contracting. Old buildings don't respect modern specializations. They need someone who understands the whole system." It sounded exactly like what Victoria needed. Yet she hesitated. After years of deferring to Alexander's judgment, making decisions through the filter of his preferences, she was determined to maintain her independence in this new chapter. The last thing she wanted was to replace one man's influence with another's. "I appreciate the information," she said carefully. "I'm still assessing the scope of work needed. Once I have a clear plan, I may be in touch." Nathan nodded, seemingly unsurprised by her caution. "Fair enough. Frank has my number when you're ready." He turned to leave, then paused. "One piece of free advice, though. Don't use that northeast bedroom outlet. The wiring there is a fire hazard waiting to happen." Victoria frowned. "How would you know that?" "Round. I did some work for the previous owner before he ran out of money," Nathan explained. "Never got to finish the rewiring. Just be careful up there. Old lighthouses deserve respect." With that, he nodded goodbye to Frank and left the store, leaving Victoria with the distinct impression that she had just been both warned and challenged. There was something about Nathan Callahan that intrigued her, a quiet confidence without the arrogance she had grown accustomed to in Alexander's corporate world. "He's right, you know," Frank said as he finished bagging her purchases, "about Nathan being the best and about that lighthouse deserving respect. It stood against 100 years of nor'easters, saved countless lives in its day. I do respect it," Victoria said, gathering her bags. "That's why I bought it. To restore it properly, not tear it down or modernize it beyond recognition." Frank smiled approvingly. "Then you and Nathan should get along just fine. He feels the same way about old buildings. Says they have souls." Victoria thought about this as she drove back to the lighthouse, her car loaded with supplies. The idea of a building having a soul would have seemed fanciful to her a month ago. Now, as she pulled up to the weathered structure that had already begun to feel like home, she wasn't so sure. Have you ever felt a connection to a place that seemed almost spiritual? As if the walls themselves held memories, stories, a presence that welcomed you? That evening, as she worked by lantern light, having discovered that the wiring in the kitchen was as questionable as the bedroom outlet Nathan had warned about, Victoria found herself thinking about the restoration specialist. There had been something compelling about him, a quiet confidence, an understanding of old structures that matched her own architectural appreciation. She needed help. That much was clear. The electrical issues alone were beyond her capabilities, not to mention the plumbing problems and structural repairs needed in some areas. Yet the thought of hiring someone, of sharing this space that had so quickly become her sanctuary, gave her pause. "What do you think?" she asked aloud, addressing the lighthouse as she had begun to do when alone. "Should we let someone else in?" Only the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below answered her. But somehow, it felt like affirmation. If you love watching people rebuild themselves piece by piece, like this video. Subscribe so you never miss the next story that proves it's never too late. The next morning, Victoria woke to the sound of rain pounding against the windows. A spring storm had rolled in overnight, bringing with it driving rain and fierce winds that howled around the lighthouse tower. She lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the elements rage outside, feeling strangely secure despite the weather's fury, until water began dripping onto her face. Victoria sat up with a gasp, realizing that the roof was leaking in multiple places. She scrambled to move her air mattress, then grabbed buckets and pots from the kitchen to catch the worst of the leaks. Within an hour, she had positioned a dozen makeshift receptacles throughout the keeper's house, each filling steadily with rainwater. By noon, the situation had worsened. Water was now seeping in around several window frames, and a particularly alarming crack had appeared in the ceiling of what had once been the dining room. Victoria stood in the center of the chaos, soaking wet and increasingly concerned that her new home might not survive its first storm under her ownership. Sometimes the universe has a way of forcing our hand, of making decisions we've been avoiding. For Victoria, that moment had arrived in the form of a leaking roof and the very real possibility of structural damage. The decision made itself. Victoria grabbed her phone and the business card Frank had pressed into her hand at the hardware store. Nathan Callahan answered on the third ring, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Callahan Restoration. This is Victoria Morgan, Reed, from the lighthouse," she said, stumbling over her own name. "I have a situation here." "Let me guess," Nathan replied, a hint of knowing humor in his voice. "Your roof is leaking in approximately 14 places, water is coming in around the south-facing windows, and you're worried about that crack in the dining room ceiling." Victoria was momentarily speechless. "How did you?" "I told you, I know old buildings," Nathan said. And I know what that lighthouse does in a nor'easter. Sit tight. I'll be there in 20 minutes. True to his word, Nathan's truck pulled up outside the lighthouse exactly 20 minutes later. Victoria watched from the window as he emerged into the driving rain, pulling on a weatherproof jacket and grabbing a large toolbox from the truck bed. She met him at the door, relief washing over her, despite her determination to remain independent. "Thank you for coming so quickly." Nathan nodded, shaking rain from his jacket as he stepped inside. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the buckets and pots, the water stains on the walls, the sagging section of ceiling. "Not as bad as I expected, actually," he said, setting down his toolbox. "The old girl's weathered worse storms than this." "The old girl?" Victoria repeated, amused by his personification of the lighthouse. Nathan shrugged, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Spend enough time restoring these places, you start to think of them as having personalities. This one's a fighter. Stubborn." "I'm beginning to see that," Victoria agreed, leading him toward the dining room, where the ceiling crack concerned her most. Nathan worked methodically, moving from the most serious issues to the minor ones. He reinforced the dining room ceiling with a temporary brace, sealed the worst of the window leaks with materials he had brought, and even climbed partway up the tower to secure a hatch that had come loose in the wind. Victoria followed him, holding tools when asked, observing his methods, and asking questions about the lighthouse's construction. Unlike Alexander, who would have dismissed her interest or simplified his explanations as if speaking to a child, Nathan answered thoroughly, treating her as an equal. "The original structure was built in 1879, he explained as they worked. "The keeper's house was added 20 years later. That's why you see the difference in construction methods between the tower and the living quarters." "The foundation seems solid, at least," Victoria observed, having inspected it herself during her initial assessment. "Granite," Nathan confirmed. "They built these places to last. The problems are mostly cosmetic, though that electrical system needs a complete overhaul before you do anything else." By late afternoon, the immediate crises had been addressed. The storm continued to rage outside, but the lighthouse stood firm, its interior now secure against the elements' intrusion. "I can't thank you enough," Victoria said as Nathan packed up his tools. "What do I owe you?" Nathan considered for a moment. "How about a cup of coffee? If you have any. You look like you could use one too." Victoria realized she hadn't eaten since breakfast, too busy managing leaks to think about food. "Coffee I can manage, and I have some sandwiches I picked up in town yesterday." They sat at the small table in the kitchen, the least damaged room in the house, eating sandwiches and drinking instant coffee as the storm gradually began to subside outside. The simple meal, shared in companionable silence, felt more genuine than any of the elaborate dinner parties Victoria had hosted in Boston. "So," Nathan said after a comfortable silence, "what brings an architect from Boston to an abandoned lighthouse in Harborview?" Victoria looked up, surprised. "How did you know I'm an architect? Or from Boston?" Nathan smiled slightly. "Small town. News travels fast. Frank mentioned you had an eye for structure that suggested professional training. As for Boston," he nodded toward her bag in the corner, where a Boston Symphony Orchestra tag was visible on the strap. "Observant," Victoria acknowledged, deciding how much to share. "I needed a change. A project that was entirely my own." Nathan nodded, not pressing for details she clearly wasn't ready to give. "Well, you've certainly found one. This place will keep you busy for a year, at least." "I'm counting on it," Victoria replied, with more honesty than she had intended. Nathan studied her for a moment, then set down his coffee cup. "Look, I understand wanting to do things on your own terms, but this lighthouse, it's a big undertaking for anyone, let alone someone working alone. If you're interested, I could help, just with the specialized work that requires licenses. Electrical, plumbing, structural reinforcement. You'd maintain creative control." Victoria hesitated, the independent part of her bristling at the suggestion she couldn't handle the project alone. Yet the practical side, the architect who had once managed complex projects, recognized the wisdom in his offer. "I'd need to see credentials," she said finally. "References. Examples of your previous work." Nathan smiled, clearly having expected nothing less. "I'll bring them by tomorrow, if the weather clears, along with a proper proposal for the electrical rewiring, which needs to happen before anything else." That seems reasonable, Victoria agreed, surprising herself with how easily the decision came. As Nathan prepared to leave, the storm now reduced to a gentle rain. He paused at the door. One question, if you don't mind. What are your plans for this place? Once it's restored? Victoria realized she hadn't fully answered that question for herself yet. I'm not entirely sure, she admitted. A home, certainly. Beyond that, I'm still figuring it out. Nathan nodded, seeming to understand the uncertainty behind her words. Sometimes the building tells you what it wants to be, if you listen closely enough. He glanced up at the lighthouse tower. This one has been guiding people home for over a century. Some purposes run too deep to change. With that enigmatic observation, he departed, leaving Victoria to ponder his words as she surveyed her storm-battered but still standing lighthouse. Perhaps she and this structure were more alike than she had initially realized. Both weathered by storms, both in need of restoration, both with purposes yet to be rediscovered. Who else feels something forming between them already? Drop A in the comments. And if you're new here, subscribe. This love story isn't just romantic, it's redemptive. True to his word, Nathan returned the next day with a portfolio of his previous restoration work, impeccable references, and a detailed proposal for rewiring the lighthouse. Victoria was impressed despite herself. His work showed not just technical skill but a genuine respect for historical integrity, preserving original features whenever possible while making necessary modern upgrades. Your proposal is thorough, she acknowledged after reviewing the documents, and your portfolio is impressive. That Queen Anne Victorian on Harbor Street, that was your work? Nathan nodded. 3-year project. The owners wanted to preserve everything possible down to the original doorknobs. We had to source period-appropriate replacements for anything too damaged to save. It's beautiful, Victoria said sincerely. I noticed it when I first drove into town. They agreed on terms. Nathan would handle the specialized work requiring licenses, while Victoria would manage the overall restoration plan and handle the cosmetic renovations herself. He would begin with the electrical system, the most pressing safety concern. As the days turned into weeks, a rhythm developed. Nathan would arrive early, often bringing coffee for both of them, and work on the electrical rewiring, while Victoria tackled the endless cleaning, scraping, and prepping needed before any cosmetic restoration could begin. They worked well together, moving around each other with an ease that surprised Victoria. Unlike Alexander, who demanded constant attention and acknowledgement, Nathan was comfortable with silence, focused on his work rather than on impressing her. When they did talk, the conversation flowed naturally, covering topics from architectural history to local legends about the lighthouse. They say the last keeper still walks the tower on stormy nights, Nathan told her one afternoon as they took a break on the porch, watching waves crash against the rocks below. Old Captain Harlow kept the light for 40 years before they automated it. Locals swear they sometimes see the light shining from the tower during bad storms, even though the mechanism was removed years ago. Do you believe in ghosts? Victoria asked, curious about this practical man's take on the supernatural. What would emerge from the ruins of her marriage and this abandoned lighthouse? Neither Victoria nor the universe knew yet, but the journey had begun. She slept on her air mattress in what had once been the keeper's living room, the sound of the sea lulling her into the deepest sleep she'd had in years. Morning brought reality in the harsh light of day. The lighthouse looked even more dilapidated than she remembered. The scope of work required truly daunting. Victoria spent the day making lists, taking measurements, photographing every room to document the before state. By evening, she had filled a notebook with plans and sketches. The keeper's house would need to be gutted to the studs in most areas. The tower itself was structurally sound but needed significant cosmetic restoration. The grounds were overgrown, the path to the private cove nearly impassable with brambles. It was overwhelming. For a moment, doubt crept in. What was she thinking? Taking on a project of this magnitude alone? She had been out of the field for years. Her professional contacts were outdated. She had no crew, no contractors lined up, not even a clear plan for what the space would become when finished. Victoria sat on the porch steps as the sun began to set, exhaustion settling into her bones. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Alexander, one in a stream she had been ignoring since her departure. This one was different from his initial angry messages, taking a softer approach. Victoria, please come home. We can work through this. I've canceled my meetings for the next week. We can go away somewhere, just the two of us. Talk things through. 15 years is too much to throw away. I miss you. For a brief moment, Victoria felt the pull. The familiar was tempting, even when it was toxic. She knew exactly what life with Alexander looked like. The routines, the expectations, the boundaries. This new life was a terrifying blank canvas. Have you ever stood at the crossroads between the comfortable but toxic familiar and the terrifying but promising unknown? Which path did you choose? Then she looked up at the lighthouse, silhouetted against the darkening sky. Broken, but still standing. In need of care, but full of potential. Just like her, Victoria deleted the message without responding and turned off her phone. Tomorrow would be soon enough to face the world again. Tonight was for rest, for gathering strength for the journey ahead.